Thanks everybody for joining us today. If you're new to this event series, this is our Live with Astronomer that we do every other week. These are our shorter form live events, so we typically keep the content to 15 to 20 minutes, very much developer focused, so less of the kind of background information that we would go through in a full-length webinar, and much more practical, which today is going to certainly fit into that category. Super excited about the topic today. Before I let us get into that, I do have a couple of just community updates I'd like to go through. If there are any folks in New York City out there tonight, there is an MLOps meetup, or I should say MLOps with Airflow meetup happening. There'll be lots of pizza and beer and some great speakers. So if you're in the data science world and in New York City, definitely consider going to that. There's also happening next week, most of the week, I think, there is the Python Web Conference, which is fully virtual, not Airflow specific, but there will be a talk on writing Airflow DAGs and introducing the Astra SDK, which we have talked about in previous events here. Tamara is actually co-presenting that with Daniel Imberman, who's part of the Airflow PMC and helped develop the Astra SDK. So that's going to be a super exciting event. I'll throw a link to the registration in the chat. Again, that's fully virtual, so you can join from anywhere. And I was there last year and there were lots of other great talks as well. So definitely consider that. The last thing I'll throw out there is Airflow Summit has just been announced. This is happening in September of this year in Toronto. The CFP call for proposals is open. So if you are interested in speaking, and would like to chat with us about submitting a proposal, Astronomer is one of the sponsors of the event. We would definitely love to hear from you. Or if you have any questions about the Airflow Summit, you can go ahead and reach out directly to me. I will throw my email in the chat as well. And with that, I think that's all I have for community updates. Again, a few logistics just for today. This event is going to be recorded. As we said earlier, you will receive a recording probably tomorrow in your email. So no worries if you want to rewatch. Hopefully you will. There's great content today. Feel free to ask any questions in the chat or in the Q&A feature in Zoom. I will answer them as we're going through if I'm able, and if not, we'll save those for the end for Q&A with Tamara. And all right, I think that's everything that I had to go through. So super excited to throw it on over to Tamara, who's a developer advocate here at Astronomer. She's going to be covering the new dag.test function and how you can use it to have easier development of your DAGs, a topic that we all love to learn more about. So with that, Tamara, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Kenton, and welcome again to everyone who joined in the meantime. I'm going to talk about one specific function that is actually very powerful, called the dag.test function. And at least for me, the more I learned about this function, the more excited I got about the feature, and I hope it will be the same for you. Okay. Before we jump into the code, I want to quickly show you some prerequisites. This slide looks like there are many prerequisites, but it's actually just 3 main ones. And it's more about the things that you don't need. So it's important if you're using dag.test in your DAG code and you run that DAG file, the environment within which you are running the file needs to have Airflow installed, the Airflow Python package, and it needs to be version 2.5.0 or later, because the dag.test function did not exist in previous versions. As I said, you can either have the Airflow Python package installed, or you can also run these commands from within a Docker container. Then you would have to bash into the Docker container, and you can verify that you have Airflow installed and which version by typing Airflow version. The second thing that is important is that if your DAG is using features that need the Airflow Metastore or Airflow Metadata database, then you need to have a database that exists. One big example is if your DAG is using XCOMs, like my DAG in the demo will. And this means Airflow, the Airflow database has to have been initiated. If you have ran Airflow in your environment at least once, this is already the case, but you can also verify that by running Airflow DB check, and you can initialize your database by running Airflow DB init. And the last thing you need to keep in mind is if your DAG is using provider packages, then the environment from within which you are running your DAG file needs to have those packages installed. So either the Docker container you're in, or a virtual environment, or your local environment. Now, what you don't need, and this is part of the many exciting things about this function, is you don't need a scheduler or an executor that is running. So Airflow doesn't have to run for you to debug your DAGs anymore. And this is the power that happens. The tasks are just run in a Python process. And this also means that the tasks are running really fast and failing fast. All right, why and when? Why would you want to use dag.test? Dag.test allows you to debug and test your DAGs directly in your IDE. So you can do all of the things that you usually do when you debug Python code. You can step through the code line by line. You can use breakpoint. You can use the Python debugger. As I said, you do not need to start up the scheduler. So you don't need to bother with, for example, which scheduler is running. At least I am often running, or I'm often working in different Airflow projects. And sometimes I want to just quickly debug something in one project, but I have another Airflow instance running, and I don't want to spin that down and spin the other one up, and you don't need to do that anymore. And you can use your IDE's debugging tools. I will show you how to use dag.test from the command line to make it IDE agnostic for this live. But at the very end, I'm going to show you how to use it with the VS Code debugging tool. When do you want to use dag.test? You can use this with any DAG, but it's most useful if you have a lot of Python custom code. So either you are using the @task decorator or the Python operator, and you want to make sure that the functions that you put in are correct or need to debug those, or also if you're using custom operators and you want to debug your custom operator code. And the last thing is, it's also very useful if you're using the Astro SDK. I will not have time to go into that in this live, but if that's something that you're interested in, keep an eye out for our upcoming webinars about the Astro SDK, because we will cover dag.test with the Astro SDK in those too. Okay, that was all for slides. Let's jump right over. Okay, we are in my VS Code environment. And the first thing you're going to notice, especially if you've seen several webinars of ours, is that I'm not in an Astro project. So you don't see the DAGs file or the include file or a Docker image as usual. I did this in order to show you that you don't even need to be in an Astro project or in an Airflow project in order to use dag.test. But of course, it doesn't hurt if you are. So you can use dag.test on your DAG files in your DAG folder, and you don't need to pull out your files at all. Okay, so what I have in my folder here is one DAG file, dag test example, and I have one other Python file that defines a custom operator that I'm using in this DAG. And the rest of the files are just some documentation and some configurations. All right, first, make sure we have our prerequisites. Make sure I have Airflow installed, 251, very good. Next, make sure I have an Airflow database, successful connection, perfect. I also know that I have the provider installed that I'm using. You can see it's green here, but this is another thing to make sure. And of course, you can also use a virtual environment if you don't want to install everything in your local environment. All right, the next thing I want to show you is that I don't have Airflow running. I'm looking to my other screen because I'm going to copy paste this command. So you don't need to see me type that out. We have no alive scheduler, and there's also no Docker containers running. So on this computer, Airflow is currently not running. All right. So before we are starting to debug this DAG, I want to quickly explain on a high level what this DAG is doing. We can see we use the @dag decorator to define the DAG function, dag test example. And then we just have 3 tasks. So it's a very simple DAG structure. We have 3 sequential tasks. And the first task is called extract orders. It uses the S3 hook to connect to an S3 bucket in my AWS account, and it pulls a JSON file which contains orders from a customer for my imaginary chocolate shop. And it reads the contents of these files and returns the contents. So this should be a couple of orders a customer placed. Next, this output is passed into a second task, which sums up all the amounts that my customer owes me for his individual orders, and it adds a shipping cost. And the last task is mainly here because I wanted to show you how to debug a custom operator too. But it's doing something very simple. That's why I called it my basic math operator. It takes in two numbers and an operation, and then it does the math on these two numbers with the supplied operation. So what you can see here is a Jinja template. In case you are newer to Airflow, this syntax might look a little weird or unfamiliar, but this just means we are pulling from XCOM the return value of this task. So this just pulls in whatever the second task returns. And the second number is drawn from a DAG level parameter, which is called discount. And then we multiply those two. So we are applying a discount for our customer because they are a loyal customer buying a lot of chocolate from us. And then we set the dependencies of the tasks, call the DAG function. And this is what you would usually have in your DAG. So far, it's just normal DAG. Next, I want to show you what you can add in order to use the dag.test method. And it's all just a couple of lines of code. You have if name equals main. This just means only run this if I run the file directly. We are setting the paths to some configuration files. We can set the discount dynamically. So let's say they are a very loyal customer. We give them a 25% discount. And then we use the DAG object here and call that test on it. You can call that test without putting any parameters in, but you have 4 optional parameters. You have the execution date, so we can run this DAG for any date that is past the start date of it. So for example, I could even run this for a date over almost a year in the future. And this is mainly important if you're using the execution date somewhere in your code. We can also run it with different connections. So that is how passing in the configuration to one of my connections is how I'm able to make a connection to the S3 bucket, even though Airflow isn't running. We can pass in our variables, and then we can run our DAG with config too. So here is where I pass in my discount, which is later pulled from the DAG parameters. All right. That was a lot of talking. Let's actually run this. And I told you I'm going to show it from the command line, so you can use it in any IDE. You'd simply say Python and then the file name. So you're running the Python file as you would run any script. We're hitting that. And it's already done. I warned you it's going to be fast. It ran all of the tasks already. And if you're familiar with Airflow, you will recognize these. These are the logs from each of the tasks that were running. And they were running in their order. The XCOMs worked, the connections worked. It worked like a real DAG, and I didn't have to start up Airflow. And this already is pretty cool and pretty useful if you're developing a DAG. But now let's enter the debugging part. So it says all our tasks are successful, but a few of you will have already spotted this. In the end, our customer is owing us a negative amount. So they bought chocolate for minus $570. That can't really be. So there is something wrong in our DAG and we need to debug. Now, previously, before dag.test existed, what I would do is I would go to the Airflow UI, I would rerun my task, I would start adding print or log statements to my different Python functions or even to my custom operator and try to figure out what happened. But now with the dag.test function, I can use breakpoints. And let's add a breakpoint in every single task. So in the first 2 tasks. And let's also add a breakpoint in our custom operator here. So now we have 3 breakpoints. And let's run this again. What happens now is, as soon as the code hits its first breakpoint, which is here on line 38, it will enter the Python debugger. And now you can do anything that you can do in your normal Python development with the Python debugger in your Airflow DAG. So what I can do, for example, is I can say, well, I want to print out an expression. I want to know if the issue is in my in the file that I'm pulling from my S3 bucket. Maybe the input of the data was wrong, and I should have done some data quality checks. So let's print out output. Okay, now we can see what was in the file that was pulled, and we can see someone ordered a lot, but it's all positive. So the negative value is not coming from here. What I can do next is with S, I could step through the code line by line. So I can step to the next line, and you can see we are stepping through Airflow code now through the code of the Python operator, but this would take a long time. So let's use C, which stands for continue, and let's run to the next breakpoint, which is here on line 45. Okay, let's hit C, and we end up at line 45. Again, I could print out any expression, but for example, a shorthand that I really like is A. This will print out all the arguments. So we can see all the values, the same string. So this again is not the issue that we're having. The other thing I want to print out is the shipping cost. Minus 2,000. I think we might have found our issue here. The shipping cost that is added here to the sum of the orders is a big negative. So looking at these numbers, yeah, this results in a negative number. And this means actually if we step through, we will see the output of this sum orders plus shipping function. This output is negative, and this is why in the end our customer gets a negative value for all their orders. But let's do due diligence and jump to the last breakpoint. This breakpoint, if you remember, was actually set in our custom operator code. And what I wanted to show you here is that I can do the same tests of expressions. So I can do self.firstNumber. And we can see the value of self.firstNumber at this point. We can also say what is self.firstNumber. It's a float. Okay, good. This is super useful if you're doing conversions between strings and JSONs and bytes and run into confusion there and want to quickly figure out how a different value changes for your functions. And one of my personal favorites is I can pull the source code of any object that I have access to. So the custom operator here is inheriting from the base operator. And normally when I use operators that exist or any code that already exists and I pull it from a package, I will often go to that GitHub repository to look up exactly what are the parameter names to put in. And this always takes time. But now I can just say, give me the source code of the base operator. And then I have the full source code. So I could find out exactly which parameters the base operator uses and how to interact with it. All right, and the last C should take us to finish. Okay, let's fix the issue. Back in our DAG, you can see the variable that I'm passing in. I'm passing it in through a variable's path. So it's defined in the variable's YAML file. So let's go over to that. And yep, the debugging was correct. We have minus 2,000. It's not a reasonable shipping cost. Let's say the shipping cost, because someone orders in Switzerland and shipping is expensive here, is 50. And let's rerun our DAG with this new value. So you can see I can quickly change any variable value, could even change which AWS account I'm connecting to, or also, let's say this delayed the customer's order. So we give them a bigger discount now. And let's rerun. This time I will just hit C on all of the breakpoints to quickly get through. And now the end result is around 700, 770. So this is a much more reasonable result for the order for our customer. All right. That was the main thing I wanted to show you for debugging from the command line. The other thing that you might be interested in now is how do I define the connections exactly? I will not show you my connections file because it has the secret to connect to my AWS account, but I made a template file. And you can see you simply name your connection and then you put in all the parameters that you would normally put in to your connection. And you can do this with all types of connections to all external tools. All right, the last thing, if Python developers are listening, you've probably been kept saying, why are you in the terminal? There's a debugging tool in VS Code, and it does work with the debugging tool. So if we click on debug and then we do run and debug, now we entered the VS Code debugging interface, and it's already running, ran automatically, and it will also stop at all of our breakpoints. And what we also can do is actually add breakpoints with the little red button here. So then we don't even need to define our breakpoints in our code. So we could say we add a breakpoint here. And then we can use the usual tools like continue to jump from breakpoint to breakpoint. And this just has a lot of other sugar that you can use when debugging. One of my favorite examples is you can see all the variables that you have access to here, and you can actually watch a specific expression. So for example, I can say, watch what output gives me. And where it is currently, it shows me where it is. Output would give me this JSON, but if I jump to the next breakpoint here, output is not defined here. So I can jump through and we'll get all sorts of information here at the side. And of course, you will already have that configured the way you like it, but you can use all of these debugging tools now with your Airflow DAGs. All right. And that was it from me. Let's jump back. I don't have a last slide, just thank you and ready for questions.
Awesome. Thanks for going through that, Tamara. This is obviously such a helpful function. We were very excited about its release in Airflow 2.5. I have answered a couple of questions already. We've also had some great discussion about chocolate. So great example there. There are a couple of questions I haven't answered yet that I think would be good to address live. The first, and I'm going to broaden this a little bit, but somebody asking, is this going to work with Docker operators? So I think let's broaden that to a question of which operators in general is this useful for and which is it maybe not?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. And I wish I would have tried it out, how deep you can get into it. But my suspicion is that you wouldn't be able to add a breakpoint to the code within the Docker operator because you're just importing it. Like I'm importing the base operator here. I couldn't add an additional breakpoint in the base operator code. So it's going to be mostly useful that you can, for example, pull the source code of Docker operator if you are at a point in your code where you have access to that object. But I don't think you can enter the Docker image that you're supplying, which is probably what you're getting at with the question. As far as I know, you can't do that. You would have to debug the scripts and the code that you have within the image separately. So this is really mostly useful if you're using a lot of Python inside of your DAG that you have written yourself. So in my case, I always think whenever I write, the more code I write, the more chances for bugs are happening. So if you're using the add task decorator or the Python operator or the SDK and writing Python code, that's probably when this dag test function is going to be the most useful to you.
Great, that's a great answer. I'm going to address a couple of questions just to go back to the beginning on how to set up use of this function. In general, you don't have to import anything to use it. It's part of Airflow. So as long as you have Airflow installed in your environment, you add it to a DAG file, you're good to go. You just add it at the end like Tamara showed there. In terms of where you can run this, so Tamara is running locally in a virtual environment right now. Again, you do have to have Airflow installed in whatever environment you're running in. the dag test command in. You don't have to have Airflow running, but if you only ever run Airflow like in a Docker container, and you don't want to install Airflow on your local computer or in a virtual environment or something like that, then yes, you would want to run it from the container, and you can totally do that. You would just exec into the container and then run from there. And that's why part of why running from the terminal is helpful, although you may even have your VS Code connected to Docker and fancy things like that.
Yeah, small addition to that, if you're using the Astro CLI, there's Astro dev bash and then -s, and that way you can run, you can exec into the running scheduler container without needing to copy the ID.
Great. And then a couple questions about connections. If somebody's using a custom XCOM backend, so they're sending their XCOMs to like an S3 bucket, how is that going to work with this function?
It should work if you're providing the connection in your connections YAML file, but I'm actually not entirely sure if it's going to use that or if it's by default going to use the local Airflow database. Because as you can see, we don't have any .env, like we're not defining these environment variables here that you would normally define in your .env, or that you would define in your Docker image. So that's something that would be interested to test out if you have a reason to use your custom XCOMs backend, like you have a custom serialization function, if that would still work. That's a good question for an edge case that I haven't tested yet, but I will test that out. If it works, for example, if you're returning a pandas data frame that you couldn't JSON serialize. One way that you could get around this if you're just testing locally might be by turning pickling on, but very good question. I think you would have to turn that on in your local Airflow configuration file, like the Airflow CFG. That was a very long-winded answer for saying I haven't tested it personally, but it's a really cool question.
I think that's a good answer. Definitely some more to explore there. And then our last question is on the passing in connections. So this specific one was, does that template accept service accounts? So I think the answer to this is kind of you're passing connections in an analogous way to how you would to Airflow. So Tamara, you can show the example template again, but anything that you would typically pass to, a connection that you're defining in Airflow, you would be able to pass in here as well.
Yes, this should take any connection that you would normally either define in the Airflow UI or with an environment variable. It's very similar to defining connections as a JSON. So it should take it. If it doesn't work, then please tell us. Please stay in the Airflow Slack.
Should work. Okay, great. Well, I think that's all our questions. Thanks so much to everybody for joining us today. Again, we were definitely going to do more on the topics of, Airflow local development and debugging and things like that. We know that's something that everybody who works with Airflow deals with every day. So again, definitely reach out if you have any other comments or questions or anything about the community events we mentioned earlier. And if not, like Tamara said, stay tuned for more on even dag.test in future webinars. So thanks for that, everybody. And we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Have a good day. Bye.
Yeah.